They said she didn't belong on that field. The drills were for the strong, the seasoned, the ones built to take pain and give it back twice as hard. To them, she was too calm, too quiet, too soft for the kind of punishment the training demanded. The air that morning carried a tension she could almost taste, a mix of sweat, dust, and the faint echo of mocking laughter that followed her every step. But she didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that the ones who talk the loudest usually have the least to prove. Every insult, every snide comment was another weight added to her shoulders, and she wore it like armor. When they called her soft, she let the word sink in, not as an insult, but as a challenge. They didn't know the hours she'd spent before dawn, practicing holds until her fingers bled, repeating techniques until her body moved without thought. They didn't see the bruises that came from training alone, with no applause, no partner, no mercy. They only saw what they wanted to, a woman surrounded by soldiers who thought she was a mistake in uniform. The laughter started small, a few smirks exchanged as she stumbled during warm-up drills. Then came the jokes, the exaggerated sighs when she took her turn. She heard every word. Maybe she's here for admin. But she can't even lift her gear. Watch her fold halfway through the drills. But what they didn't realize was that she was listening not to their words, but to their rhythm, the pattern of their doubt. And with every beat, she built her focus. When the instructors barked orders, she followed without hesitation. She didn't waste time defending herself or trying to fit in. Her movements were deliberate, steady. She made mistakes, sure, but each one became a lesson. Where others moved on, she replayed the moment in her mind, again and again, until her body remembered it better than her thoughts did. She wasn't competing with them. She was competing with who she'd been the day before. During one break, she sat apart from the others, stretching in silence. They joked nearby, laughing about how she was probably regretting joining. But inside her mind, there was no noise. She visualized every move she'd been taught, how to pivot, how to counterbalance, how to use precision over power. It wasn't about being stronger. It was about being smarter, sharper, faster when it mattered. She knew she couldn't win by their rules, so she made her own. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the exhaustion in her muscles whispered that maybe they were right, that maybe she wasn't built for this. But then she'd remember why she started. Not for approval, not for glory, but to prove, if only to herself, that she could stand where others thought she'd fall. The pain became her teacher, the silence her ally. When she walked back to the field, the group's eyes followed her. Some curious, some dismissive, some annoyed that she hadn't quit yet. But there was something different about her walk, not arrogance, but quiet certainty. She'd spent enough time in the shadows to understand that true strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. It watches. It strikes when the moment demands. As the next drill began, the others moved with their usual rhythm, relying on strength and instinct. She moved with intention. Every stance, every step, every breath was measured. She wasn't trying to outperform them. She was preparing to redefine their idea of power. When one of the SEALs chuckled and called her soft hands again, she didn't even look his way. She just adjusted her footing and exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the silence that had always been her greatest weapon. The whispers of doubt around her had turned into background noise, irrelevant, powerless. They didn't know it yet, but every laugh, every word, every sideways glance had forged something inside her that couldn't be undone. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even trying to prove them wrong. She was simply ready. And when the time would come, when the challenge would rise from those same voices that mocked her, she would meet it not with fury, not with pride, but with precision. The kind of precision that ends a conversation before it even starts. The kind that makes silence louder than any insult could ever be. She learned to speak through her actions long before anyone ever listened. When the noise of mockery became too loud, she found her refuge in silence. While the others wasted their breath comparing strength and bragging about endurance, she trained when no one was watching. The world outside the drill ground slept, but she was awake before dawn, her breath steady in the cold air, her body moving through motions so precise they felt like ritual. Every repetition carved away a little more weakness. Every bead of sweat whispered a single truth. She didn't need to prove anything to them, only to herself. Her mornings started before the first bugle call. The sky still dark. Her boots hit the dirt with quiet determination. The barracks behind her were silent except for the faint hum of dreams and fatigue. But she wasn't interested in sleep. She was building something that sleep couldn't give her, endurance that didn't depend on applause. The training field looked different in the pre-dawn haze. Empty, peaceful, honest. No eyes judging her form, no laughter echoing through the air, just her and the weight of her will. She drilled each move again and again until her body obeyed without hesitation. She learned to listen, not to words but to rhythm, to timing, to the sound of her boots pivoting against the ground. She practiced breathing through the pain, controlling her heartbeat, grounding her movements so even fatigue couldn't betray her. There were days her arms trembled so violently she could barely lift them, but she'd clench her fists and start again. Every repetition wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence, about showing up for herself when no one else did. Sometimes, the instructors would find her training alone and shake their heads, half impressed, half disbelieving. They thought she was trying to catch up, that she was desperate to prove she belonged. But she wasn't chasing their approval. She was building her edge, quietly, relentlessly. She'd seen enough to know that real strength doesn't need an audience. It grows in silence, like a flame protected from the wind. Her evenings were just as disciplined. When others gathered to unwind, she sat with her notes, analyzing each drill, replaying each motion, identifying what she could have done better. The flickering light from her small lamp reflected off her uniform as she stretched sore muscles, muttering the counts under her breath. There was a precision to her process, an elegance to her discipline that no one else noticed. She didn't push harder, she trained smarter. She focused on balance, timing, and control, the kind of details that separated reaction from mastery. There were nights she doubted herself. Nights when the exhaustion sank too deep, when her reflection in the mirror looked more like a shadow than a soldier. She'd stare at her calloused hands and wonder if it was worth it. All the isolation, all the quiet hours of unseen effort. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself that this silence was her forge. The noise outside couldn't touch what she was creating inside. The whispers around camp grew softer over time, not because they stopped doubting her, but because she stopped reacting. The calmness in her eyes started to unsettle them. She no longer carried their words. She carried her purpose. While they flexed their muscles and competed for attention, she carried her discipline like a hidden blade. Sharp, precise, patient. During drills, she was different now. Her movements had a rhythm that others couldn't match. Her balance was fluid, her responses instinctive. She didn't move with brute force. She moved with intention. Even the instructors began to notice the control in her form, the confidence that didn't need to be loud. The same people who once dismissed her as fragile started glancing at her with a quiet sense of confusion, maybe even respect they couldn't quite admit yet. But she didn't need acknowledgement. She'd built something unshakable in silence, a foundation so strong that no insult could crack it. Her strength wasn't in her arms or her legs. It was in her stillness. The ability to keep showing up, to train when it hurt, to focus when it was easier to give up. The world mistook her silence for softness, but silence was where her power lived. Every early morning, as the sun began to rise, the light would hit her face, and she'd pause for a second, not in pride, but in gratitude. The kind of gratitude that comes from knowing she hadn't needed to fight them yet, because the real battle had been against herself. She'd already won it, over and over, in those quiet hours where no one clapped, no one watched, and no one believed. Her strength was not loud, not dramatic, not for show. It was quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable. The kind of strength that waits, patient, ready, for the moment when silence finally demands to be heard. It started as a joke that spread through the camp like wildfire. Someone said she should be given an easier drill, something soft, something that suited her better. The words were tossed casually, coated in mockery, but they landed with precision. She heard them, every syllable, every laugh that followed. And though her expression didn't change, something in her eyes did. She didn't respond, didn't defend herself, didn't explain. Because explanations don't silence mockery, proof does. That morning, the air was heavy with anticipation. The instructors had decided to mix things up, pairing the cadets with members of an elite SEAL team for combat drills. It wasn't meant to be fair. It was meant to test who could adapt under pressure. The moment the announcement was made, heads turned toward her. Some smirked. Others whispered bets about how long she'd last before tapping out. A few offered half-hearted encouragement, the kind that dripped with disbelief. But she stood there, still, steady, like someone who had already rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. The field was a furnace, the ground littered with dust and echoes of shouted commands. The SEALs were confident, relaxed, their movements sharp and practiced. They'd done this countless times before. She was the only one without a visible edge, no swagger, no aggression. Just a calm focus that made her seem almost out of place. When the instructor barked, "Pair up," she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward before anyone could volunteer her, locking eyes with the one who had laughed the loudest the night before. His grin faltered, just a little, but he covered it with a snicker. They circled each other, the rest of the group forming a rough ring around them. The challenge wasn't official, but everyone knew what it meant. This was her test, not of strength, but of worth. The instructor gave a nod, and the moment the whistle blew, the SEAL lunged. He was fast, confident, his movements filled with the kind of strength that came from years of repetition. She didn't resist, she redirected. His momentum became his downfall. He hit the ground before anyone realized what happened. A short, sharp movement, efficient, deliberate, final. The air went still for a second, then filled with murmurs. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply reset her stance. Another SEAL stepped in, more cautious now, less arrogant. The onlookers leaned forward, expecting the first move to have been a fluke. He attacked harder, using speed and unpredictability. She flowed around him like water meeting stone, soft on the surface, unyielding beneath. He too found himself on the ground, staring up at her in disbelief. By the third and fourth, there was no laughter left. Just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than applause. The challenge had started as a joke, but ended as something else, a reckoning. Each of them had underestimated her not because of her size or her rank, but because of a belief deeply rooted in habit. That quiet meant weakness. But in her silence, she had studied them. Their posture, their rhythm, their overconfidence. She had learned to see what they missed, the gaps, the pauses, the patterns in their movements. She wasn't stronger than them. She was more precise. She didn't fight harder. She fought smarter. The instructor didn't stop it immediately. Maybe he wanted to see how far she could go, or maybe he was as stunned as the rest. By the time he called it off, the tone of the field had changed completely. The whispers were gone. The same men who had once laughed now stood with arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. Respect, the kind that isn't spoken but felt, hung in the air. She gave a small nod, not in victory but in acknowledgement, and stepped back in line. For the rest of the day, the drills continued as usual, but something was different. When commands were shouted, no one snickered at her hesitation. When pairs were assigned, no one tried to avoid her. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle but powerful. She had redrawn the line, not through defiance, not through argument, but through demonstration. Her silence had turned into a language of its own, one that every soldier on that field suddenly understood. Later that evening, while others recounted the moment in hushed voices, she sat alone, cleaning her gear. Her hands moved methodically, her mind calm. She hadn't done it for them. She hadn't done it for recognition. She did it because she had to. Because every woman who walked into a space like that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken expectations, and someone had to show that grace and strength could exist in the same heartbeat. She didn't need them to say she belonged. She had already proven it. Her silence had spoken for her, and it was louder than any roar. The air shifted the moment the whistle blew. It wasn't loud or dramatic, But everyone on the field felt it. That sharp drop in noise right before something unexpected happens. The soldiers who had been laughing seconds before leaned in, expecting an easy show, another reason to snicker. But what they saw instead silenced them before the first move was even made. She didn't charge. She didn't posture. She simply stood still, calm, focused, her stance balanced like she was made of stone and patience. The SEALs approached with the confidence of men who had seen every kind of opponent. They knew how to read hesitation, how to exploit fear, how to break balance. What they didn't know was how to read someone who wasn't afraid. She watched them move, her eyes tracking every shift in their weight, every tightening muscle, every breath they took. She had studied this, lived this, trained for this exact moment. To everyone else it looked like stillness, but inside her, calculations were firing with precision. The first one made the move, fast, aggressive, overconfident. His arm shot out, aiming to grab and unbalance her. But before contact was even made, her body shifted just enough to redirect the momentum. A blur of motion, a sharp twist, and he was down, breath knocked out, staring up at the sky. The sound of impact echoed through the field, followed by a silence that carried weight. The others froze for a fraction of a second, unsure whether it was luck or skill. The second came without hesitation, stronger and sharper than the first. He expected her to react defensively, to retreat, but she didn't move back. She moved in. A step inside his reach, a pivot at the waist, and he was airborne for a brief second before hitting the ground beside the first. The dust rose, catching sunlight as it drifted around her. Stillness again. She didn't speak, didn't celebrate. Her eyes were steady, waiting. The crowd around them had gone quiet enough that even breathing sounded loud. The third and fourth didn't wait for an invitation. They attacked together, hoping to overwhelm her. For a moment, it was chaos, bodies moving, boots striking the dirt, shouts cutting through the air. But where they were frantic, she was fluid. She ducked under one arm, redirected another, using their strength against them. One fell hard. His arm twisted and pinned before he even realized he'd lost balance. The other tried to recover, but her counter came too fast. A simple, efficient motion that left him flat on his back. It all happened in less than a minute. 4 trained Navy SEALs, men known for precision and power, were on the ground, staring up in stunned silence. She exhaled slowly, stepping back, resetting her stance. There was no trace of pride on her face, only focus. The kind that comes from discipline, not ego. Her breathing was steady, her movements clean, her posture unchanged. The others on the field didn't move. They didn't know whether to clap, to speak, or to question what they had just witnessed. Even the instructors, usually quick to critique, said nothing. The dust settled around her boots as if the world itself was pausing to catch up with what had just happened. The same voices that once called her soft now said nothing at all. The SEALs stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from their uniforms. One of them met her eyes, gave a slight nod, not of defeat, but of respect. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of something earned. She nodded back once, acknowledging it without words. The kind of respect that passes between warriors doesn't need to be announced. It's felt. She walked back to her position without fanfare. The others stepped aside instinctively, not out of fear, but recognition. Something about the way she carried herself demanded space, not because she took it, but because she had earned it. Her stillness now had a different meaning. It wasn't misunderstood anymore. It wasn't weakness. It was control, the kind that comes from mastering not just a skill, but oneself. No one called her soft after that. The title didn't fit anymore. They had seen what precision looked like when driven by purpose. She had dropped 4 Navy SEALs with one move each, not because she was stronger, but because she had learned what they hadn't. That real strength doesn't come from muscle, but from mind. From calm in the chaos. From confidence, so quiet it makes noise unnecessary. The drills continued, but something fundamental had shifted. Where there was once mockery, there was awareness. Every soldier on that field had witnessed something that rewrote the unspoken rules of respect. She had done what words never could. She had made silence louder than laughter. The salute that would come later wasn't just for skill. It was for the control, the calm, and the courage it took to stand alone and let her actions tell the story that no voice ever could. The following morning, the air at the training base felt different. It wasn't the kind of difference you could measure. It was the kind you felt in the small pauses between voices, in the way people moved around her without speaking. Respect has a way of changing the atmosphere. It lingers, subtle but undeniable. She walked across the field with her usual composure, not looking for acknowledgement, not expecting it, but the difference was visible in the eyes that followed her now. Those who once doubted her strength were now trying to understand it. The instructors had seen hundreds of cadets over the years, some loud, some reckless, some brilliant, but none quite like her. There was no arrogance in her walk, no bitterness in her tone. She carried herself like someone who had already fought 1,000 unseen battles, the kind that happen within, where no medals are given and no witnesses exist. That quiet kind of power unsettled people because it didn't announce itself. It simply existed, unshakable. That day's drills were tougher. The instructors had raised the intensity, pushing every cadet to the edge of endurance. Mud clung to boots, sweat dripped from faces, and every breath burned. But she didn't break pace. Her movements were efficient, measured, conserving energy where others wasted it. She wasn't the fastest or the loudest, but she never faltered. Every command was answered instantly, every task completed with precision. The others began to notice that she didn't compete with them. She competed with herself. As the sun climbed higher, the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Some cadets began to slow, their forms slipping under exhaustion. The instructors barked orders, urging them to push harder. She moved through it all like she was built for endurance, her rhythm steady, unbroken. There was something almost hypnotic about her focus. It wasn't about showing strength, it was about proving control. Even when fatigue threatened to pull her down, her discipline held her steady. During combat drills, she was paired again with those who once mocked her. The memory of what had happened before hung unspoken between them. There was no laughter this time, no smirks. When they faced off, her stance was calm, her breathing slow, her eyes locked on her opponent's shoulders, reading every micro-movement. The first strike came fast, but her response was faster, smooth, deliberate, and controlled. She redirected the attack, pivoted, and had him off balance before anyone had time to process the motion. It was efficient, minimal, and flawless. Even the instructor, a man known for his cold composure, couldn't hide the flicker of surprise. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply watched her, studying how someone could combine such fluid grace with tactical precision. Her every move spoke of discipline built from repetition, from hours of unseen work when others had already given up for the night. She wasn't relying on talent. She was relying on relentless preparation. By afternoon, word had spread beyond the drill yard. People whispered about the girl who had dropped 4 seals in a single exercise and then walked away without saying a word. The story grew with each retelling, but she paid no attention to it. She was too focused on what came next. For her, every challenge wasn't about recognition. It was about evolution. The goal wasn't to prove others wrong anymore. It was to prove herself right. Later that evening, while others rested, she was still on the range, practicing silent takedowns, perfecting balance, fine-tuning every motion until it felt like instinct. The air was quiet except for the sound of gravel under her boots. The sun dipped low, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, and she moved like part of the landscape, deliberate, enduring, unbreakable. The same instructors who once doubted her now watched from a distance, understanding that they were witnessing something rare. In the barracks, conversations shifted. Those who once used her name as a punchline now used it as a reference point. The word soft never came up again. They began to ask her questions, small ones at first, about form, about focus, about endurance. And every time, she answered with simplicity, not superiority. She helped them, corrected their stances, gave tips on control. Her leadership wasn't declared. It was earned quietly through action. The next morning, the SEAL who had been the first to challenge her approached her on the field. There was no tension now, no pride in his voice. He simply said that her technique was solid, cleaner than most they'd seen, even in advanced training. It wasn't flattery. It was truth spoken from one warrior to another. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. That single exchange carried more meaning than applause ever could. Her journey through the drills became something larger than training. It became an unspoken lesson for everyone watching. That strength doesn't always roar. That control can silence doubt more effectively than anger ever could. She had changed the narrative without ever arguing, without demanding validation. Every drop of sweat, every precise movement, every moment of restraint had built something that couldn't be shaken by laughter or dismissal. She didn't just win their respect. She redefined what it meant to deserve it. When the ceremony day came, the base was unusually quiet. Rows of cadets stood in formation, uniforms pressed, boots lined perfectly against the asphalt. The flags caught the morning light, snapping gently in the wind. It was a day reserved for recognition, for those who had endured the toughest phase of training and emerged stronger, sharper, and disciplined beyond measure. She stood among them, the same woman who had once been the subject of whispered jokes and skeptical glances. There was no trace of nervousness in her expression, only the still calm of someone who had fought her battles long before this day arrived. Her journey through the program had been watched closely. What started as disbelief had turned into quiet curiosity, and then into a kind of awe that few could express aloud. She had broken no rules, made no grand declarations, yet somehow she had altered the air around her. The instructors, seasoned veterans of countless classes, knew when a cadet carried something extraordinary. And she did, not through strength alone, but through an unyielding sense of purpose. The commanding officer stepped forward, his presence commanding instant silence. His eyes scanned the line of cadets, landing for a moment on her before moving on. He began to speak about courage, about perseverance, about the kind of discipline that doesn't waver under pressure. The words echoed across the field, bouncing off walls that had heard countless speeches before, but this time they felt heavier, as though every syllable carried a story that everyone already knew but no one dared to voice. As the ceremony continued, awards were handed out one by one. Names were called, applause followed, and the air filled with the rhythm of recognition. Then, unexpectedly, her name broke through the stillness. For a split second, time seemed to pause. The cadets turned slightly, some exchanging quick looks, others standing a little straighter. She stepped forward, her movements crisp, her gaze unwavering. The same field where she had once been doubted now stretched before her like a quiet witness. When she reached the front, the commanding officer regarded her for a long moment before speaking. He didn't recite her achievements. Everyone already knew them. Instead, he said something that would stay etched in every mind that heard it. True strength doesn't always come from muscle or rank. Sometimes, it comes from restraint, from endurance, from never letting doubt rewrite your purpose. His words hung in the air, weighty and still. Then, in a gesture that caught everyone off guard, he stepped back and saluted her. For a heartbeat, the entire field froze. Even the wind seemed to stop. The Navy SEALs, the same men who had once dismissed her as too soft, stood motionless, the disbelief on their faces slowly giving way to respect. A salute from the commanding officer was more than acknowledgement. It was reverence, a symbol reserved for those who had earned a place beyond hierarchy, beyond expectation. She returned the salute without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her movements fluid and respectful. It wasn't triumph that flickered in her eyes. It was quiet validation, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't gloat, doesn't need to. Every hardship, every sneer, every lonely night of practice had led to that single moment of silent recognition. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about being seen, finally, for who she had always been. When she stepped back into formation, the energy among the cadets had shifted entirely. There were no more whispers, no more sideways glances. Even the SEAL who had once challenged her looked toward her with a different kind of regard. Not pity, not surprise, but acknowledgement. For the first time, They saw her not as an exception, but as a standard. As the ceremony concluded and the ranks began to disperse, she walked off the field slowly, each step deliberate. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the ground. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, but their eyes followed her as she passed. One of them muttered under his breath, "That's what leadership looks like." And though it wasn't meant for her to hear, the words carried far enough. Later, as the others celebrated, she found herself alone by the water's edge. The reflection of the base shimmered on the surface, fractured by the ripples of the wind. She watched the horizon for a long time, not thinking about victory or recognition, but about everything it took to reach that point. The isolation, the pain, the doubt that had once felt suffocating. The salute wasn't what defined her. It was merely the world catching up to a truth she had known all along. Behind her, the sound of boots approached. One of the SEALs stopped a few feet away and spoke quietly. "You changed how we see this place," he said, his tone steady but sincere. She didn't respond, didn't turn. The silence between them said more than words could. Respect doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a shadow stretching across the ground, unnoticed until you feel its weight. When she finally walked away from the water, the base no longer felt like the place where she didn't belong. It felt like the place she had redefined. The drills, the mockery, the exhaustion, none of it had been wasted. It had carved something deeper, something that couldn't be shaken or dismissed. She didn't look back as she left the field. The salute still lingered in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it, a single, powerful moment that turned disbelief into silence and silence into respect.